Welcome to the Ultimate Tourism Chat. Stay with us as we talk about the ins and outs of tourism. I am your host, Chief Koti, and on this episode, we look at tourism, aviation, and a bit of wildlife conservation. We also get to talk to AviaDev Chief Executive Officer John Howell on the way forward for African tourism and aviation post the COVID pandemic. We will also be talking to English travel journalist and blogger Stuart Forster, who gives us his perspective of African tourism during these trying times. Zimbabwean tourism operator and conservationist Sharon Stead shares with us her company's efforts towards wildlife preservation and its corporate social responsibility activities on affected rural communities. And now this edition of the Ultimate Tourism Chat Show is brought to you by Intimate Store Zimbabwe. Go and check out their Facebook page, Intimate Store ZW, and get to find out more on the wide range of products that they have to offer. Let's dive into matters that matter. That's tourism and aviation. Now, the aviation and tourism industries in Africa and the world at large take a battering with a potential to bleed billions of dollars in revenue following the impositions of total lockdowns by governments to avert the impact of corona. And the tourism and travel sector in the continent is expected to have so far lost in the region of $50 billion and at least 2 million direct and indirect jobs. Now, the International Air Transport Association, better known as IATA, says Africa's air transport industry contributes about $55.8 billion, which translates to about 2.6% to Africa's GDP. And this supports a total of 6.2 million jobs. I had a conversation with AviaDev Chief Executive Officer John Howell, and I first asked him to share his thoughts on the impact of the pandemic on African tourism and the aviation industries.
This is an ongoing crisis. From an operational perspective, obviously, there are no airlines flying, there are no tourists crossing borders, but it's more about the erosion of confidence of people willing to get on an aeroplane or willing to go on a trip abroad. And then added to that, which compounds this issue as well, is, of course, if there's going to be this kind of economic recession and downturn, is there going to be less money in people's pockets? What the world looks like post, we don't know. You can scenario plan, but the longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be to recover.
From a planning perspective, what does a national tourism organization or a tourism business owner, what would you encourage them to be looking at?
It's really difficult. I mean, the first thing is, what kind of support exists for you to survive? You know, is there some sort of relief package? Is there some sort of financial support? The most important thing to do at the moment is engage all of the stakeholders. So creditors, employees, get them on board, get them to, obviously everybody understands the magnitude of this situation, but we need to keep communicating. We need to talk to everyone and say, look, we're all impacted by this, and somebody stomping their feet, demanding their money when that money isn't in the system. In a way, I don't care which business you're in. Nobody can really contingency plan for a complete cessation of all activities. And of course, you've got different levels of engagement when it comes to that. So you have businesses within tourism with many, many hundreds of employees that obviously have a huge revenue, but then obviously a huge cost base. And then you have the small single operators where you've got one mouth to feed or one family to feed. But it doesn't make it any easier. So everybody's being impacted. I think the point is at the moment not to be marketing as such, because we aren't out of the woods yet. But I think it's at the moment we're still in risk mitigation mode, which is communicate, engage, have those conversations, collaborate as well, look for partnership, use this time now to reinvent your business model. You know, what can we be doing differently? What do we think it will look post-COVID? And what do we need to put in place now that's going to put us in the best position to be successful in that new environment.
In our previous episode, we were talking about the African airlines and what probably the future looks like for them. The reality on the ground is that there isn't that much support financially from the governments and all that, but they still need to breathe. Your take on that end of things?
I've just actually received some images from a friend of mine who's the chief operating officer of Africa World Airlines, a private airline operating in Ghana, of them today operating flights with social distancing, with sanitation measures. That's happening today. So the first thing to say is people are adapting already. I think that in terms of specific airlines, I wouldn't necessarily talk about that per se, because a lot of these are government-owned airlines, and ultimately their survival depends on how much the government are willing to support them. And I think that with SAA, for example, it's simply a case of there isn't the money in the system to continue to keep it alive, keep the oxygen flowing. So there's talk there about liquidation. Maybe that won't happen. Maybe there'll be a brand new airline started straight away. There's all sorts of things. But what I would say, and this is to quote Raphael Cucci, who's from IATA, who's the VP of Africa for IATA. He was on one of my webinars a couple of weeks ago. He said, look, this is an existential crisis. If we don't get that support, we're going to be starting with no airlines because they cannot survive based on zero revenue. So what it's going to come down to is which governments can afford to and choose to prop up their national airlines or create an enabling environment. And how long this goes on will ultimately determine that, because every day people don't realize that an airline not operating, of course, it costs them a fortune to store the aircraft and maintain it. It still needs maintenance, even though it's sat on an apron somewhere. They only make money when these birds are in the air, and they're not able to do that at the moment. We haven't heard enough from governments. The one government that's come out in Africa is Senegal, has come out and said, we're putting more money in here. I think it will happen, because ultimately Africa is huge. Africa is landlocked majority, and it doesn't have viable alternative transport. Aviation is the key to unlocking the tourism potential. This is all about government policy, because most of the airlines are government owned. How much money have these governments got, and how willing are they to give that to the airlines to keep them alive?
I want to segment Africa a little bit there, John. You talk about Africa being landlocked. Obviously, I have a very huge interest in SAA's situation at the moment, although you don't want to really go into the individual airlines. But they are such a big cog of the tourism ecosystem within Southern Africa to start with. They are the connector with the international markets. They are the connector with the regional markets. Your take on South Africa coming to its knees at this particular time where there's going to be need for a vibrant recovery plan, which probably was going to be anchored on a viable and very efficient airline operating out of Southern Africa.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I think that, we can talk about the market down in Southern Africa. I mean, ultimately, you've got some private airlines down there like Safair, SA Airlink, which was a franchise of SAA. You've got obviously the Comair Kalula brands as well. And I'm sure you'll get others that are starting. Cape Town to Johannesburg, I think, is the 9th busiest route in the world. If there is a business case, and this is what it all comes down to, which is what my business is all about, I want routes to be developed based on the business case making sense. So what I would say is within any, nobody wants to see, I say nobody, there are people obviously that say, hey, we've been putting money into SAA for 10 years without a return. It seems like a bottomless pit. There are people that say that, and they're saying, oh, good riddance. But it's very simplistic to look at that and then say, but there'll be a void because you've got unemployment, you've got a value chain that is supported by those employees and by that business. That comes crashing down too. But ultimately, if the business case is there, that void will be filled in time by other airlines. And this is where there is an opportunity to kind of open the skies a little bit more and be more flexible, because maybe we'll have to without those big players.
Very candid and sharp conversation there that I had with the AviaDev Chief Executive Officer, John Howell. Now, AviaDev is an aviation development company which is dedicated to growing connectivity to, from, as well as within the African continent. Now, we have not had enough from African governments where aviation is concerned. What are they doing? Are there any stimulus packages that are set for recovery for this particular sector? So we need to see governments coming up more often and more pronounced in their plans of recovery. And so far in Africa, it's only been Senegal who have outrightly come up and said they are going to support their airline in these tough times. And the South African Airways debacle continues, whether to liquidate the company, set up a new airline or not. There are a lot of jobs that are going to be lost as well. And when you look at the sector in its totality, it provides about 2.6 million jobs directly. And this translates to a significant and more pronounced 2.6% contribution into the African GDP. Something exciting for the African continent, President of the Republic of Zimbabwe, His Excellency Emmerson Mnangagwa, allocated a 500 million Zimbabwean dollar stimulus package for the tourism sector. The package is to mitigate the impacts of the coronavirus on the industry and helps resuscitate it. We will discuss this matter in detail in the upcoming episodes, but still staying with Zimbabwe, tourism operator and conservationist Sharon Stead, the managing director of Stead Safaris, says the going has been tough on tourism players as 2020 bookings are essentially non-existent. As someone who has a passion for wildlife, she tells us more about her company's efforts towards wildlife preservation and their social responsibility activities on affected rural communities. In our conversation, I first asked her on her assessment of the impact of the pandemic on tourism.
There's no doubt that this pandemic has created unprecedented turmoil for tourism globally. And initially, the main fear was of one of us contracting the virus, the coronavirus. One of us being the staff or one of the camps or lodges. But as the months have passed and the level of cancellations of tourist bookings are being received, it now becomes a scramble and fear for one's own business survival. So my company is 30 years old this year, and we have a pretty good established footprint in the market. And we're currently looking at 100% of those bookings between March and June having either been cancelled or deferred to 2021. And from discussions with other operators, we're seeing mass hesitation for bookings for the rest of the year, and these are likely to diminish as the months go on. So they're hesitant to confirm future bookings, and my guess is that this tourism high season for Zim, which is April to October, is pretty much a write-off, and there will be no significant movement of international tourists this year. Most of the safari lodges and camps in Zim, who have a corporate social responsibility for conservation and communities, are going to suffer without these tourism dollars flowing through. Conservation initiatives will suffer tremendously. It's a massive concern.
As far as wildlife conservation is concerned, what do you think needs to be done going forward? How best can we make sure that we still conserve our environment and our wildlife and all the things that are required for us to maintain these God-given facilities and animals? How best do you think we can find a way forward?
I think now more than ever, it is essential that those who have concessions in and outside our national parks should be concentrating on assisting Zimbabwe National Parks Authority and Forestry Commission with their anti-poaching efforts. Zimbabwe's ultimate tourism resource is our incredible wildlife attraction outside of Victoria Falls, obviously, and it absolutely has to be protected at this time, and it is the joint responsibility of tourism operators together with Zim Parks to keep it healthy. Without that, we have very little else to compete with in terms of being an attractive destination in the region. I foresee a heightened increase of bushmeat poaching across the country as more jobs are lost and food security becomes an issue. There are incredible private initiatives that have been working solidly throughout this lockdown with regards to conservation and community projects. But you talk about our God-given heritage, and I do believe it is the responsibility of everyone, entire country, to be aware, vigilant, and to take measures to preserve it in any possible way. Our conservation and community projects are ongoing, especially at this time even more so. And I mentioned earlier that we are celebrating 30 years with my company this year and have launched an online campaign called 30 for 30. $30,000 for the 30 years of operation. I'm quite excited about that. These funds will go towards several areas. One of them is our drought relief and food program. On the conservation side, we build lion predator-proof livestock bomas. These are permanent structures and we've built 9 in the Mabali community to date. And we work with those communities here in terms of reducing human-wildlife conflict which is a big thing in Wangi National Park and on the outskirts of Wangi. Living with wildlife is ongoing education and support, I suppose. We currently have 15 students from junior school level to university level, and we support those and wish to increase those. And sustainable community projects, whereby we assist communities with startups to become more sustainably independent and to support their fellow communities. Of course, we have our eco warriors, what I call our wildlife anti-poaching unit. These need continual support.
Great initiatives there by Sharon Stead and her team. These are tough times. We need to support one another, and they are leading from the front, doing a fabulous job on keeping our wildlife preserved and taking care of these communities that service the tourism sector. You are listening to the Ultimate Tourism Chat, which is proudly powered by Intimate Store. Let's hear from seasoned English journalist and blogger Stuart Forster, who gives us his perspective of African tourism during these trying times.
I'm fortunate enough to have travelled to sub-Saharan Africa several times and really enjoyed travelling within Zimbabwe. Unfortunately, I can see that the impact of the COVID-19 virus is going to be prolonged and impact the tourism industry for some time. At the moment, it's difficult to judge further specifically how that'll be, because I'm sat here in England at the moment and we're currently not permitted to travel abroad. I think there are some big questions about how insurance companies are going to cover travel in the post-COVID-19 world. Will we get coverage if we are taken ill with COVID-19 when abroad? Well, possibly not. And what's going to happen about coverage for flights and transport and travel? All those are issues that people are concerned about right now. I think that it's going to be different after the lockdown has ended, because people are already talking about being more focused on sustainable tourism. And in that respect, I think Africa, Southern Africa, Zimbabwe in particular, can offer a lot. When I've travelled there, I've seen some wonderful lodges in and around the national parks, and I think there's potential there for Zimbabwe to market itself as a place to travel to. I think there will still be demand, particularly in the luxury sector, for travel experiences. People are sick and tired of being at home here in the UK. That's clear in debates on Zoom and in discussions on Facebook. In many ways, I hope that's indicative that the tourism industry is going to bounce back. Of course, whether people need certificates in order to travel and show that they don't have COVID-19. Obviously, as a travel writer, I want to be telling stories that are inspiring people and encouraging people to travel and to make them travel in a responsible way too, because I think one of the key things that we need to all work on together is to get the world moving again, but in a far more responsible way.
A very interesting perspective there from Stuart Forster, talking about the fact that people are sick and tired of being at home. They want to travel, and he reckons there's going to be an interesting shift towards luxury travel. There's going to be hurdles as far as insurance is concerned, and I can tell you that for a fact insurance is going to be an issue. Maybe something that we need to look at here on the show as far as insurance is concerned for the hoteliers, for anyone else who's operating within the tourism industry. That was Stuart Forster there, my man from England. He is a journalist and blogger who has a huge interest in Africa, and of course we appreciate him for coming through to the show. And this brings us to the end of this edition of the Ultimate Tourism Chat with Chief Koti, and many thanks will go to our partners Intimate Store Zimbabwe for making this production a reality. Babe na dobala bo dende bafuna